Section 4, Part 2, Achieving Change. Hello again, I'm Joseph Baines, Disability Development Officer from London Sport. I'm speaking to you using a sign language interpreter because I'm a profoundly deaf person and I rely on British Sign Language to communicate. There will be some pauses as the interpreter's working. So today we're going to go through Section 4, Part 2, Achieving Change, and we'll be focusing on how to communicate effectively with 4 key groups of disabled people. The information that you'll see on the next few slides is not exhaustive, so it's really important for you to get to know the disabled person and interact with them, and then adapt your communication style to meet their needs. We have to remember that not all disabled people would agree with what we're going to go through in this part of the course. And because communication is personal, it's really important that we recognise and adapt to meet the disabled person's needs. If you're not sure, it's perfectly okay to ask the disabled person directly. They're not going to be offended. This section is longer than some of the other sections, so allow yourself plenty of time to listen to the presentation. When we get to the red slide at the end, it shows we've come to the end of Part 2 of Achieving Change. Communication tips, deaf and hard of hearing people. There are various ways to work with deaf and hard of hearing people, but remember that this list above is not exhaustive. To get a deaf or hard of hearing person's attention, try waving at them or touching them gently on the upper arm or shoulder. It's not rude to do that. And most deaf people within the deaf community would do this with each other. However, not everyone likes to be touched, and so it is worth waving first to get their attention, and then asking them if it's okay to tap them on the shoulder to get their attention in future. Just because someone wears a hearing aid, it doesn't mean that they can hear. Hearing aids help by amplifying sound. However, not everyone will understand what the sound is or what the direction of the sound is. If you're in a loud room, for example, where there's music, the hearing aid will amplify all of the background noise as well as the speech. So it's best practice to take someone to a quieter room to enhance the quality of communication. Don't move around whilst you're talking at the same time, or put your hands in front of your mouth, because that makes lip reading much more challenging. Equally, try not to be too far or too close to the deaf person. You want to be close enough when somebody can lip read you. Communication tips, deaf and hard of hearing people, Part 2. Try not to use long sentences and speak as succinctly and clearly as possible. This is because lip reading is hard work and takes a huge amount of energy concentrating on what a person is saying. Try not to leave out information or say, "Oh, it doesn't matter." It really does. Give the same level of information to a deaf person or hard of hearing person as you would to a hearing person. You might need to slow down your speech a little bit, but don't slow down so much that it can feel patronising. There is no point in shouting at a deaf person. That can be embarrassing for everyone, And also, not all deaf people would hear you shouting anyway. Speak clearly and try and use the same tone as you would with a hearing person. Don't pretend to understand what a deaf or hard of hearing person is saying to you. Try to make the effort to communicate in different ways to make sure that you both have full understanding of each other. Check if the deaf person or hard of hearing person understands you, and ask them if they would like you to repeat something in a different way. Be patient. Also consider lighting, as it's very important. If you're in a dark room, it's a real challenge for a deaf or hard of hearing person to see or lip read you. So make sure that the room is well lit to allow them to see you clearly. Also make sure that the sunlight is not behind you, whether you're outside or the sunlight is coming through a window. Otherwise, again, it can be really hard for a deaf person to see your face when it's silhouetted from the sunlight behind. If this does happen, try and turn into a position where both of you have the sun at the side. This slide just gives you some ideas of things that you can consider when communicating. The key thing is to ask them how they would like to communicate with you. Communication tips, physically disabled people. When I say physically disabled people, I don't mean just wheelchair users, as they represent only 4 to 6% of the disabled community. Again, as I explained previously, the list is not exhaustive, and you will need to ensure that you tailor your communication methods to meet the needs of individual physically disabled people. So first of all, never lean on a wheelchair if you're interacting with a wheelchair user, or use their wheelchair as a prop when communicating, as it can be an invasion of their personal space. And any aid or wheelchair is part of their personal space. When communicating with a physically disabled person, keep an appropriate distance. There's no need to be too far away or too close. Make sure that the space between you is comfortable. Some physically disabled people may not be able to stand for long periods of time. If so, and they prefer to sit, then try not to stay communicating with them whilst you continue to stand, as that can affect their neck looking up at you for long periods of time and make them feel uncomfortable. In that case, it's best for you to sit down and continue conversation at eye level. The same is true when communicating for longer periods of time with someone using a wheelchair. But if it's a very short interaction, there's no need for you to get down to eye level with the wheelchair user. Some physically disabled people may struggle opening doors or getting through different and past different obstacles. It's okay to ask if they would like some help. Communication tips, physically disabled people, continued. Avoid communicating with carers or third parties about the disabled person. Always talk directly to the disabled person. Otherwise, they can feel really patronised, and it can make them feel left out and ignored. When you're considering marketing materials, make sure they're placed at the right height level for wheelchair users, and also make sure that, for example, posters and advertising are not too glossy. Otherwise, the reflection from lights can make it difficult to see pictures and text. Also, when you put information on your website or in marketing materials, make sure that you explain in detail what provision there is at your facilities, such as ramps, lifts, numbers of accessible toilets, numbers of disabled parking spaces, and so on. This slide just gives you a few ideas of things to consider when communicating with physically disabled people. When working on marketing materials, it would be useful to consult with disabled people for their thoughts and feedback. And if you're not sure how to communicate with a physically disabled individual, then it's okay to ask them how they would like you to communicate with them. Communication tips, visually impaired people. I mentioned earlier that the list of communication tips with disabled people is not exhaustive. Well, this applies to this list for visually impaired people as well. Not all visually impaired people are completely blind. They may have some sight, and at varying levels. They won't all have the same kinds of sight loss, and so you may need to adapt your communication method to meet their individual needs. When approaching a visually impaired person, it's always worth mentioning your name and saying who you are and who you work for. After ending the conversation and before you walk away, say to them that you're going to leave. Don't just walk away, leaving them talking into empty space. They may want to use you as a guide, standing on either side of them. If they do, they may also want to hold your elbow. In that situation, walk slightly in front of them to lead them, and make sure that you don't bump them into obstacles or doors. Mention to them as you're walking when you're approaching an obstacle or door. Communication tips, visually impaired people continued. So if you're going up or down the stairs with a visually impaired person, stop at the top or bottom of the stairs and then mention to them roughly how many steps there are before you guide them towards the first step. Also show them where the handrail is as you're going up or down, and then mention to them as you approach the last step. When showing them around the centre or club, describe the surroundings and layout in some detail, such as where sounds are coming from, where there are uneven floor surfaces, and where the changing rooms are, and so on. Depending on their preferences and their knowledge of what a clock looks like, you could use a clock face method in giving them directions. So for example, 12 o'clock is in front of you, and then as you go through an environment, you can describe things such as, for example, the shower is at 2 o'clock. In military terms, you may have heard the expression, watch my 6. Well, that's based on the clock method. It just means keep your eyes at 6 o'clock, which is behind you. Not that I'm suggesting that you'll be getting into guerrilla warfare situations with visually impaired people. It is just one of the ideas for helping visually impaired people to navigate around the built environment. If possible, allow visually impaired people to feel their own surroundings so they can build up an image, a mental map of where they are, which will help them to move around independently next time they visit. And explain, as I explained before, ask them how they want you to communicate with them. Communication tips, people with a learning disability. I mentioned previously over the last few slides that this list of communication tips is not exhaustive. So please ensure that you adapt to make sure that you meet the individual needs of a person with a learning disability. as not all of their communication styles will be the same. In the same way as with other disabled people, everyone's an individual. Now, people with a learning disability all learn in different ways, and so you need to make sure that you meet their own individual needs. So you can do this through visual demonstrations, or explaining things in different ways, or use of pictures. Sometimes we don't realise how complex our language is, and we often forget that not everyone has the same grasp or level of understanding and background knowledge. The best way to deal with this is to try to simplify your language. Now, that's not the same as dumbing down the language and leaving out information. You'll still need to provide the same level of information to a person with a learning disability as you would to a non-disabled person. You just need to do it in a different way. For example, by writing short plain English sentences, using a large font, and using pictures on the left-hand slide to describe what you're saying in the sentence to reinforce the message. Communication tips. People with a learning disability continued. So instead of giving continuous information whilst talking to a person with a learning disability, try to allow them enough time to take on board and process information bit by bit. You may need to repeat what you've said, but if so, say it in different ways. To check if someone understands you, the best way is to ask them to explain back to you what it is that you've explained to them. Try to avoid using leading questions, yes/no questions. Rather use open-ended questions instead. This allows them to explain to you and demonstrate to you what they've understood. Sometimes pictures and words at the same time can be useful and will be the best way to communicate. Sometimes people may have picture cards which will allow a person with a learning disability to understand more fully when communicating with you, and vice versa. Some people with a learning disability may have their own cards to use. Avoid speaking directly to carers or family and friends. Always speak directly to the person with a learning disability, and make the effort to communicate in different ways with them. It's about finding the right way to establish communication which makes it more personable and will help the person feel valued. Don't assume that someone can or can't understand something. Find out from them. Summary slide. Well done in making it this far, and we hope you've learned something useful from this course. We've now come to the end of this disability awareness course. Remember that this is an introductory course, so it would be worthwhile for you to attend a face-to-face disability awareness course where you can take part in more practical activities or explore the subject in greater detail. To summarise, during this course we've covered key areas of learning that will help make you become more aware of working with disabled people. In section 1 we went through some disability related statistics and a business case for enhancing inclusion. In section 2 we've covered the differences between medical and the social model of disability and the barrier worksheet exercise. In section 3 we focused on the Equality Act 2010 and what reasonable adjustment means. And in section 4, finally, we covered terminology and the various methods of communication when working with disabled people. Action plan slide. To help make a difference to disabled people within sport, a suggestion would be for you to write down 3 key actions you would like to take to improve or change things within your club or centre, based on what you've learned from this introductory course. I've brought together a basic template action plan above, just to give you an idea of how to write up actions if you've not done it before. Research shows that if you write down your thoughts and create a plan of action, you are much more likely to take the steps to achieving inclusivity. finish. Please feel free to get in touch with London Sport if you'd like to discuss further creating a specific action plan to increase physical activity or sport opportunities for disabled people. Our email address is on the slide. It's info@londonsport.org. Thank you for taking part in this webinar, and goodbye for now.